Good morning and welcome. My name is Casey Burkholder, and I'm an associate professor at the University of New Brunswick, and alongside with Dr. Christine Campen-Robinson, one of the co-presidents of LLRC ACCLL. I'm speaking to you today from unceded and unsurrendered Wolastoqey territory, Fredericton, New Brunswick. We're excited to welcome you to the first event of the LLRC ACCLL Congress 2022, Dr. Margaret Mackey's presentation, The Facts That Traveled by Taxi, a true story measuring a generation of change. Dr. Mackey is speaking to us from within Treaty 6 territory and within the Métis homelands and Métis Nation of Alberta Region 4. This land is the traditional territories of many First Nations, such as the Cree, Dene, Nakota Sioux, Saulteaux, and Blackfoot Nations. As we gather across this territory currently known as Canada, and perhaps elsewhere too, it is important to acknowledge that much of the scholarship we report on and the work that we do happens on stolen land. It is important to know that the violence of land theft is accompanied by other violences, including and certainly not limited to anti-Black racism, queer and transphobia, and ableism, all of which flourish in our school and institutional spaces, even at Congress. Our collective ability to acknowledge or ignore these violences, as well as our own relationships to power and oppression, inform the work that we do and the work that we do not do in this association and in this territory. I will now pass the microphone over to Dr. Shelley Stagg-Peterson, who along with Dr. Margaret Lovell-Johnston have curated this pre-conference day. Thank you both so much for your time and for your labor. Shelley, over to you.
Thank you very much, Casey, and welcome to all. I want to tell you before I introduce Margaret that she is generously making her slides available. She is calling them footnotes because there is a huge amount of information on them that you will want to access later. So you'll find the link in the chat, and I can put it up again. And you will also find on the LLRC website a link to the slides after the presentation. I'm going to be moderating the Q&A session following Margaret's presentation, so please feel free to add your questions to the chat at any time. And now I'm going to introduce Dr. Margaret Mackey, Professor Emerita in the School of Library and Information Studies at the University of Alberta. I'm sure that most or all of you in our audience today are familiar with Margaret's research and scholarship, and perhaps some are in the fortunate group of her colleagues, friends, and former students. When thinking about a keynote speaker who would address an LLRC pre-conference theme of language and literacy research, past, present, and future, Margaret was the very first to come to mind. Her research and scholarship span many decades and range from exploring children's and young adult literature and reading processes in print texts to examining interpretive approaches to print, graphic, digital, and media texts, as well as the roles of popular culture in young people's lives. Margaret has been recognized across Canada and around the world with a long list of well-deserved awards and honors, including serving as ambassador for the United Kingdom Literacy Association and being honored with the Children's Literature Association's Anne Deborah Jordan Award for lasting contributions in scholarship and service. In her recent publication, One Child Reading, My Autobibliography, published by the University of Alberta Press, Margaret explored the multifaceted processes through which she learned to be a reader as a child in St. John's, Newfoundland in the 1950s. This book was named as the Scholarly and Academic Book of the Year for 2017 by the Book Publishers Association of Alberta. The jury described it as profound, tremendously innovative, wholly original and experimental, and impressive on all levels. In my experience, these words can be used to describe any and all of Margaret's presentations and writing. I'm entirely confident that you will find inspiration in Margaret's words and will find the time with her today thoroughly enjoyable, as she has the gift of the renowned Newfoundland wit. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Margaret Mackey as she tells us about the facts that traveled by taxi. It's a true story measuring a generation of change.
Well, thank you, Shelley. That's more than generous introduction. And hello to everybody, and how I wish I were looking into your faces at this point. if we want to talk about a generation of change, the last 2 years of change are kind of the fast forward version of that. But there's plenty to think about. And as Shelley said, I'm regarding the slides that I'm going to show you somewhat in the nature of footnotes, because there's no way I can deal comprehensively with the mandate I was given to talk about the past, present, and future in any real enormous sense. So I'm relegating a lot to the slides, and I'm going to talk through them and almost certainly not give you time to read them in many cases. So to begin with, I arbitrarily decided that the 1980s was going to have to be my cutoff point, partly because of the story I'm about to tell you, and partly because the changes since the 1980s have been just so massive that it seemed like a functioning time span to consider. And just to indicate how radically things have changed since the 1980s, I point you to the headline at the top of my screen here from Wired magazine. The first personal computer mouse did not appear until 1981. And when we think of how much our hands assume that there's a computer mouse attached to the end of them, now that's a really short time. That's just over 40 years. And this and many similar changes have been resonating ever since. But my fact story is a true one. In 1988, I was living in Britain. We were trying to organize a move to Canada and trying to communicate with the University of Alberta. And my husband was working in the City of London Polytechnic in the city in London. And there was fax contact with Alberta, but only between the legislative offices in Edmonton and Alberta House in London. So to fax his documents, he put them in a taxi to send to Alberta House from City Poly. They were faxed to the legislative offices, and there they kindly put them on the inter-office van, and they traveled by that van to the university. And of course, there's a 7-hour time difference. So the faxes arrived on the same day. And I've put the word fax in capital letters on the screen because that's really how we thought about it. We could not believe how miraculous this was. I don't know that we ever used the word fax except in kind of capital letters. We were awestruck. And that's 34 years ago. The swiftness of the change since then is just breathtaking. But one of the things that I want to focus on today is not just change as something forward moving. As we've changed, we've lost. And we've lost some of the new things as well. In fact, probably more than the old things. The old things have survived better. So if we fast forward to today, the website statista.com does an excellent job of supplying many different kinds of graphic representations of the world we live in now. And every year they put out what happens in a minute on the internet. The most recent one is 2021. And if you look at this slide, you'll see lots of familiar logos and things that we completely take for granted. But the numbers are just mind-blowing. 69 million messages sent, 2 million swipes, 197.6 emails sent, and so forth. Now, I would just draw your attention to the fact that what we take for granted here is not necessarily a worldwide phenomenon yet, but at the moment, the newest figures from 2021 present us with 4.9 billion people online and 2.94 billion people offline. So that is pretty astonishing development there. How we got there from here, it's almost impossible to remember. I was astonished when I went back and tried to think myself into the 1980s as to how much has come and gone, both in that time. So we went from the VCR to the DVD to streaming video. We had the YouTube revolution, which apart from anything else involved a great opening up of video to a kind of DIY element that was not there beforehand. CD-ROM encyclopedias led on to Google and searching for information there. And Wikipedia similarly opened up the idea of information to participation. And so we are contributors as well as users in this new universe. And in the case of the text-based muds and moos that were around in the 1980s, which were online fantasies developed purely verbally. People wrote the scenarios out. And they, of course, eventually developed into the massive multiplayer online games. And they too have opened up a massive user-created world of support material. It's truly astonishing with the giant digital worlds, how much user-created information can be accessed online now. So again, this notion of participation that as recently as the 1980s was only just beginning to come into existence. When I went back looking, I was quite flabbergasted to realize that I'd actually forgotten Napster. Napster, again, involved a great opening up of resources to hands-on participation. And it also made a huge difference to the media success of different formats. So cassettes fell off, vinyl fell off, CDs fell off, downloads even fell off. Now we're into streaming with another riding along the top. And if you look at the predictions for album sales, this is how they would have gone without Napster. This is what Napster did to the actual sales. So really quite a startling interference with a particular market. And then the revolutions of the smartphone and the iPad, and you can see here the dip as well. The line here is the year-over-year growth. So initially this absolutely radical jump in the possession of smartphones, but the growth is dropping away. And the iPads, the revolutionary impact is still there, but the iPad revenue as a share of Apple's total revenue is nowhere what it was at its peak. And as we just take for granted things like Google and YouTube and Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and Wikipedia and Yahoo, it's hard to remember that in the 80s we were still actually getting used to the VCR. It was new. We listened to music on the new formats of CDs, but we still used audio tapes in our Walkmans and cars, and we didn't have much to do with the internet at all. And this very week, in terms of the context of things disappearing, we said goodbye to the iPod. And the iPod, of course, was the front line of change back in the day here. So where are we now? What is the impact of this on our lives today? Well, technology gives us easy access to all kinds of reading, viewing, and listening material. We've gone to instant communication from that fax that required a vehicle at either end. We have almost infinite virtual contact with friends and acquaintances and even strangers on social media. We have gaming. We have spaces for ordinary readers to join up and speak back. So fan fiction or online book groups or podcasts. We have voices for ordinary citizens in an assortment of ways that I've summed up as online action groups, but really that's a massive territory. And the never-ending resource of streaming media. We also have the downside, the fake news, the socio-political divisiveness. We have trolls and online bullies and even death threats. We have surveillance, even of children. I tried not to load these slides with too many extraneous details, but one of the headlines that I abandoned very late on talked about Weight Watchers surveilling children as young as 8. And there's a lot of commercial surveillance going on and citizen-led surveillance as well. Some of that is parent-led, and there's a very interesting discussion to be had there about what are the rights of parents and what are the rights of children in this kind of surveillance. But overall, surveillance is something we need to be paying attention to with a view to its negative impact. We have the often overlooked fallout from the easy access to pornography and other forms of brutality. There's a lot of research to be done there about the long-term impact of this kind of access. And similarly, easy access to radicalizing political hate groups, and a huge battle over censorship, to which I will return. This is probably one of today's major issues. I mean, today as in right now. So a very quick overview, and this is one of these slides I won't linger on. The BookNet put out a report in November of 2021 talking about textual activity in Canada, and you can see general social networking site, video streaming, online video sharing, watching TV and movies. These are somewhat larger numbers than the numbers related to print. And I have found it helpful to distinguish between two kinds of reading that occur in this situation that we see as so fragmented now. There's dedicated reading, which is the case of deliberately engaging with relatively long-term reading, fictional or factual. I've given some examples here. We choose to sit down with a novel. It's Saturday. When I finish here, I will go get a coffee and I will take the two papers and sit down and read them through front to back. We pursue a research theme online or in library holdings, and this is research with a capital R for professional researchers, but also research with a small r for lay researchers. There's a lot of that. And another kind of dedicated reading that I have not put here that I think is seriously underestimated is game-related reading. People engage with the big games and they do massive amounts of background reading as they go. So compared to dedicated reading, which has been around for a very long time, there's a slightly newer setup of situated reading. And this is just reading very on the fly, very briefly, reasons that are as much social as literary. So a lot of texting is situated reading. Where are you? I'm over by the door. Or we could do a swift fact check to support a conversation, or glance at Facebook highlights, or look up the scores to see who won in the playoffs last night. A lot of that is very brief reading that fits into the context of other activities. And one of the ways that I think we get into talking at cross purposes about how much reading people do these days is in failing to distinguish between dedicated reading and situated reading. If you put them both together, people have probably never read as much before ever. If you separate them out, then the picture becomes more complicated. And that's without valorizing one kind of reading over the other. They have different purposes. They do different things. And reading is not disappearing, dedicated reading is not disappearing completely. This is a proxy here. And this is the BookNet report again about the Canadian situation. But the 55% of the respondents to their survey had visited a bookstore or a library online or in person during the pandemic. And this is for the first half of 2021. Also, some other things are more complicated than we sometimes assume. App Annie tells us that Canadians spent 4.4 hours a day on mobile apps in 2021, up from 3.9 hours a day in 2020, and that time was mainly spent on social media and communication apps. That's a lot of time in a day. The largest growth in usage in Canada in 2021, you probably won't be surprised to hear it came with TikTok. And in fact, this week, after I sent my slides to Shelley and decided that was it, I couldn't possibly tinker with them any longer, there came an announcement that TikTok is just beginning to pull ahead of YouTube in terms of public access. And YouTube has been the leader for a long time, so this is another one of those moving targets here. According to this study of the app usage, Canadians spent on average 22.6 hours per month on TikTok. But TikTok itself and other kinds of app use are complicated. On the one hand, we have this story out of Britain from The Guardian at the end of March this year. 16% of British toddlers are using TikTok, and 3-year-olds are on this TikTok, and here we see a familiar headline: it may be affecting their attention span. And this is one of the things that we just don't know about, how children's capacity to concentrate long-term is being affected by social media. On the other hand, we have Book Talk, and Book Talk is little short of a revolution in being a gateway to long-form reading. Book Talk puts people on to novels. It puts people on to inclusive novels. Book Talk has done a great push on having more inclusive titles get highlighted. And as one of the school librarians who spoke to Kelly Jensen in a School Library Journal article said, the books that gain traction on Book Talk tend to stay there. So it allows time for people to discover the books that are highlighted on Book Talk. So we've grown accustomed to these instant forms of communication. And at this point, I would suggest that we really don't know what's change, what's loss, what's gain. Mainly, what we see is things are complicated and messy out there. This little slide here shows the growth in Amazon sales steadily upwards. Some of that is people turning to Amazon for pandemic supplies, but there's also been people have read through the pandemic. Doesn't seem to be any doubt about that. And we're engaging with books differently, but it's not clear that we're abandoning them. What we have acquired is a capacity to answer back to these texts in terms of writing fan fiction or joining online discussions or putting in comments on newspaper articles. This has opened up texts in ways. You could always write a letter to the publisher, I suppose, but it didn't feel like the same sort of thing. A lot of the losses have come with things that were new in the time span that I'm talking about. Some of our changes in technological possibilities have been quite transient. They cause a revolution and then they disappear. And there's a question of whether we need to keep growing in order to survive. Is Facebook going to start fading away because it's maxed out on the amount of growing that it can possibly do, and teenagers may or may not be leaving Facebook and looking elsewhere. And so there are questions about how we deal with this instability. And I think this is a place where English teachers actually can step in. Young people are very alert to what is here now. They don't have much sense of the history of it. And I'm not sure they have much sense that a lot of this stuff is vulnerable to change in the future. And so ways of thinking about the instability of how we are processing and recording our lives are questions that it's useful to raise with young people and to think about for ourselves. When I started to think about what I have no longer got access to, this is the short version of the list, believe me. So many different formats and media technologies have vanished, and with them, a great deal of my life history is now inaccessible to me. And I put up the image of the floppies because for academics, this may be the most tragic loss of all. I don't have any digital access to my dissertation, even though I produced it digitally. I would have to go hunting for a way to get a machine that would read my floppy in order to have a digital copy of it. And this I couldn't resist. There were so many questions. This is possibly the most startling statistic that I saw on my whole trawl. The first YouTube video to reach 10 billion viewers, 10 billion views, which is just a mind-blowing number. And what is it? It's that fool song, Baby Shark. And so the combination of the sublime and the ridiculous just seems to be summed up in this particular little factoid. But there's a great deal that is changing in highly significant ways. Digital gaming, compared to 40 years ago, has moved into a much more central cultural role, even as the idea of what constitutes a game continues to shift. And there's a whole literature about that that's really interesting, but that I don't have time to go into. But that's one major change. This is one that I think most of us would hardly even register as a change anymore. The scale and scope of the DVD, the streaming video, it's just changed our notion of the relationship between the moving image and the print original, especially in terms of adaptations. It used to be that a single movie was a very small version of any book, even a short book. But now we can watch and watch and watch, and it goes on and on and on, and the franchises are taking over the movie world to a very large extent. And those franchise worlds are simply enormous. We forget how recent this is. I was doing some research in 1999. What's that, 23 years ago? That is not very long ago. And I was dealing with kids who were quite affluent and media savvy. And I was talking to, I think, 16 of them. And only 3 of those 16 had ever seen a DVD. And only one of them owned a DVD player at home. And I'll never forget the reaction of one of the boys who had never seen a DVD before. I showed it to him on my laptop, and I should say that I made history in the University of Alberta bookstore with this laptop, because I was the first person that ever bought a laptop with a DVD capacity to show a DVD. They had to import it in specially for my demands. And I showed the kids the DVDs on this laptop, and this boy said, "Wow, extreme video," in tones of reverence. And that's 23 years ago. It's startling, and now DVDs are not. Most people find DVD a clunky way of gaining access to a film. Some old battles not only continue, but are renewed in even more ferocious form. The battle against censorship is now so extreme that the American Library Association has just issued a new statement on book censorship. And while most of this extreme censorship fighting is going on in the United States, Canada is by no means immune. And we just had a very strange episode in Northern Ontario where a Cree author's book was withdrawn. And I don't know that they ever quite explained what it was that the parent had objected to, but it seems to have been a single parent being enough to have the book taken off the shelf. Another old battle now being renewed, and in Alberta for sure being renewed in very ferocious terms, is the curricular battle. And the language arts curriculum K-6 in Alberta is frighteningly narrow, regressive, and fact-driven. There's a massive battle going on here against this curriculum, but in September, the K-3 language arts curriculum is going to be put into effect with no piloting. The school boards refuse to pilot it. And so battle wages, and I suspect Alberta is not the only jurisdiction where we're going to have this kind of thing going on. Although I hope this is the worst example. And then there are the ongoing the rise of misinformation, the decline of local journalism, and the media power of the oligarchs, Musk and Bezos and these guys. But Rupert Murdoch is a reminder that this is not a new story, that we've been dealing with oligarchs and media power for a very long time. And this is where the English teachers just step up as frontline fighters. The critical literacy is the strongest obligation, I think, on the table at the moment for English teachers and for other teachers as well, of course. But English teachers really are the frontline fighters on that. And then some newish questions also about the potential for fan creation. And I've put a few questions here. Are fan creations unimaginative and exploitative? Do they short circuit true creativity? Or do they follow an ancient tradition of creative reworking led by Shakespeare? Does fan work provide fertile ground for experimentation? Does it open up ways for people to address the limitations in the original documents by broadening the gender diversity, the racial diversity, and many, many other issues of that nature? And what difference does it make that you can make your fan creation and post it for millions of people to read almost instantly? This is one of the questions that we really don't know the answer to this yet. It's a very interesting one. Now, children's screen time has multiplied during lockdowns, but screen time is shifting also. I wrote down what I knew about the screen life of one child during COVID. She was 6 when COVID, first lockdown began, and 8, she's 8 now. Reading and talking with external family members, joining a Zoom dance class. She'd been in a real life dance class and it just switched to Zoom. Distance brownies, online school lessons and discussions, all kinds of correspondence, a great deal of learning arts and crafts from YouTube, and she began to make her own private videos with very much the YouTube discourse of I'm speaking to you to explain how to do this, making other videos. She didn't post any of these. She just sent them to the odd family member. A lot of viewing of moving text images, TV and online, and gaming, and fooling around with stickers and masks and that kind of nonsense. That's quite a mixed bag. And of course, COVID altered the framework in which this all occurred. But I think it also has shifted some of our sense of what screen time can mean, does mean, will mean. Here I'm going to fly through. I really refer you to the slides as they're published. Where are we going? This is the world's briefest glance towards the future, because I don't truly understand it myself. Web 3.0 is on the cards. There's a tolerably clear explanation in Forbes, and I've given you the link for it. Web 3.0 draws on encryption and distributed computing, and it looks very interesting, and I refer you to the article. Likewise, the metaverse is on the horizon, combining virtual reality, augmented reality, and a digital economy. Very much a work in progress, and you can see even Wired has a headline that says, "What is the metaverse exactly?" So I'm certainly not going to get into it. The Globe and Mail, just at the end of April, had a very useful article about the metaverse. And the shorthand description here says, think of it as encompassing any virtual world in which you can explore, shop, play games, socialize, or even work. And where I'm not very clear is how that's different from Web 2.0, but we need to find out more about it. So I've given you the links, and I do recommend that you have a look. And I want to move on very briefly to a case study of how some of these changes have acted out in the case of a particular text, Mouse, the graphic novel about the Holocaust by Art Spiegelman. And Mouse is a really interesting example of how things have changed since the 1980s, changed and changed again. Spiegelman first produced this graphic novel in the magazine Raw, circulation 12,000, a new chapter in each issue twice a year. In 1985, it got reviewed in the New York Times Book Review by Ken Tucker, in a review that was so glowing about the potential of the comic strip or the graphic novel as a narrative form that Pantheon decided to step in and publish Mouse as a 2-volume graphic novel. And over here we see a list of some of the awards for which Mouse was nominated, most of which, as you'll see, it won. It was the first graphic novel ever to win the Pulitzer Prize in 1992. And then it went on to become an electronic revolutionary. In 1994, Voyager issued a CD-ROM edition of Mouse, containing the full text and a lot of supplementary information. This thing was fabulous, but it got harder and harder to access. I used it in one of my classes, and we used to have a competition on the first day of class, which student had the oldest laptop that might possibly still be able to read this multimedia CD. And eventually nobody owned it. Even poor students didn't own a laptop old enough to do that. To my delight, I discovered in 2011 a book called MetaMouse with a DVD inserted in it. And I just assumed that the material on Voyager's CD had been transferred to the DVD-R. But indeed, that is not the case. The CD-ROM was obsolete and unreadable, so Pantheon reacquired, remastered, reformatted this multimedia material, added some more, and produced MetaMouse. And I saw a complaint that even with all this vast amount of reworking, this thing was still inaccessible to anybody reading on an iPad, and now on Amazon it's listed as unavailable. Mouse, like any other digital text, of course, is open to fan interpretations, and because it's a graphic work, it's much more likely to be fan art than fan fiction, but it's right in the mix with there. And as of this year, it's a focal point of a huge battle over censorship and schooling. Tennessee School Board withdrew the book from its school shelves and caused a huge furore. So Mouse, in this time, has been at the center of a serious aesthetic rethinking of the literary potential of graphic texts, and changes in how they're stored and sold and marketed in general, and much greater attention to the synergy of words and images. Now, Mouse obviously is not single-handedly responsible for this, but it was a very important initial point for giving respectability to the idea of comic, the language of comics, the words and images working together. And it also, of course, was one of many invitations to participatory fan reworking of these graphic ideas. During the 80s, especially with DVDs having space to spare, to add a lot of background information, there was a surge of cultural interest in how texts are constructed. And Mouse moved into that territory when the CD-ROM, the Voyager CD-ROM and MetaMouse were easily accessible. They were just a goldmine for anybody truly interested in the complex and original work that Spiegelman did to create this story. But also at the same time, the Voyager CD-ROM and MetaMouse were a reminder of both the benefits and the risks of this bleeding edge technological change, because obsolescence came into the mix as well. And Mouse actually got 2 bites of the cherry for its digital supplements, but I'm not confident that we have safe access into the future to this wonderful material. And now we see a hard social swing against upsetting political sensibilities. One of the complaints the parents made in Tennessee was that there were naked images in Mouse, but the naked image is a naked mouse representing the historical reality of the Holocaust. The Jews in Mouse are mice. The Nazis are cats. And so it was a naked mouse that these parents were concerned about. Spiegelman himself says it's a culture war that's totally out of control. And it's something that we need to be paying very sharp attention to. And the calls for censorship are coming from more directions than one. The largest group of censorship calls, though, are coming from people who want life to be, they want text to be bland, white, not upsetting to the most sensitive sensitivities. And in 20, from the 1st of July 2021 to the 31st of March 2022, PEN America it found 1,586 bans implemented in 86 school districts across 26 states in the United States. So that's not a flash in the pan. That is a serious commitment to reducing the variety and inclusiveness of the materials on school shelves. The sales of mouse itself soared, and some people, Dave Egan, for example, is committing to buy replacement copies for students in some jurisdictions that have had books denied to them. And Brooklyn Public Library, I think, has said anybody in the country can borrow a banned ebook from their electronic collection. So people are stepping up with finding ways to do workarounds, but there's a political battle in here that I think is sooner or later we're going to have to fight it politically, because access through the actions of individuals is not the same thing as public access. And it's the public access battle that we need to be considering. So very swiftly, as a summary and a conclusion to all of this, I like the case study of mouse just because it represents so many of the different changes just in a single example. New concepts of an appropriate balance of words and images, and also that question of authority and rights that comes up with fan work. Who owns the images of mouse? Who has the right to do what with them? Then we have new considerations of the text as an artifact with all this how I made mouse. What considerations went into the artistic decisions that gave us mouse, combined with technological experimentation and obsolescence, and now the political pressures as well. And these aspects of mouse highlight shifts in aesthetic priorities, both authorial and participatory, critical attention to media construction, technological forces, and social and political stresses. And in my final slide before the acknowledgements, I've produced these four sets of forces on the left here, but it's the questions on the right that I think are important for us to consider when we think about past, present, and future in language and literacy research. Teaching, one of the things that is important to keep researching is how teaching works in the face of all these dynamic forces. And I think we need to consider how our thinking is changing because of all these different energies fizzing around in our society, and how changes in our thinking will lead to changes in teaching at whatever level we're teaching, because teachers are the people who are going to help us and today's young people start to make sense of it and start to find ways of thinking about our current communication framework as transitory, as a system in development, will help us think about where we establish our priorities in terms of what's worth keeping, what we can let go, what is going to be taken from us, whether we want to let it go or not, what's worth fighting, where we need to be addressing our best energies to keep a critical eye and help our young people to develop a critical eye about a situation whose transience is probably its most startling quality. And a very brief note of thanks to the website Statista, and I do recommend, I've given you the link here, I recommend it. They will send you charts and graphs every day if you sign up. General thank you to Shirk, who've supported my work for 30 years now, 30 years this spring. A link to part of the battle against the Alberta curriculum, and a good recent summary overview of the censorship battle in the US from The Guardian from April. There's much, much more out there. You wouldn't believe how much I streamlined out of these slides because they were unreadable. There was so much material, but there's a great deal for us to think about and a great need for us to be thinking in the most strategic terms possible. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Margaret, for this fascinating journey of gain and loss, benefit and risk, as technology and societal values and assumptions have changed and continue to change what we think of as texts and our relationships with texts and with each other in text-mediated interactions. And indeed, there is a wealth of information. Thank you on behalf of everyone for all of the links. Our learning will certainly continue as we follow the links and connect with others to talk about all of these provocative ideas and the information you've provided. And I see that there is a question. No, there's the links in the chat. Does anyone have a question that you'd like to ask of Margaret? And maybe, Margaret, can you please stop sharing your screen, and then we'll be able to see all of the participants.
Right. Stop share. There we go.
Maybe I'll start with the question as everyone's thinking about what they'd like to ask. I noticed that you have some in-press writings, and I'm just wondering, you're continuing to write, conduct research. What questions and issues are top of mind for you, Margaret?
They vary. The in-press thing there that I should have put a link to that. It's only sort of connected to everything I've talked about here, which is probably why it didn't occur to me to put the link there. I got interested in the sense of being very intensely, almost physically present inside a story world, which of course is a very deep and personal and private experience. And what interested, I was interested in that as an experience, and I gave a couple of examples of where I had felt that myself. But what really interested me, that I think is a larger issue, is if we believe that reading contains this core, private, silent, inward component, A, how do we make room for that in classrooms where people are reading socially and collectively? And B, and probably more importantly in the current context, how do we defend that right to private experience in reading in a world that is hell-bent on accountability, replicability? Reading doesn't matter unless it matches what everybody else does and you get the correct checklist on the word count and that sort of thing. So finding a way to make a public defense of a private experience was the question that really intrigued me there. That's why that little summary account of the Alberta curriculum was in that article, because of course the Alberta curriculum is a test bed, probably like no other in the country at the moment, of how there is no room in the language arts curriculum K-6 as it is currently drafted for any kind of pleasure in reading or sense of ownership of reading, or let alone a place for a private experience of reading. And so how do we take that fight public when it's about something that's so innately private? And so that's one thing I've been doing. What I should really mention is that I've been doing a lot of work on readers in a particular place, and I have a book coming out this summer called Space, Place, and Children's Reading Development that deals with my big research project. This is my last big SSHRC project, where some young people made digital maps of a place that was important to their literate youth and then talked to me about it. And that has been completely spellbinding. It's been very, very interesting. And again, the paradoxical. We're in a digital age. A lot of these people cross the world. They moved from China or Iraq or India to Edmonton for me to interview them. And yet they're all talking about their childhood reading being rooted in one place or another. So we haven't lost our physical lives just because we've moved into these massive digital lives. The physicality of reading is still a major element in what's going on there.
Yes, interesting that you use the word place. That's come up in the research that I've been doing as well, thinking about how there are sometimes assumptions about what the place might be. When you look at commercials on TV, it seems to be urban. If you're going to be rural, you're out in a Jeep somewhere splashing through the puddles on a mountain trail, that kind of thing. So yeah, interesting that the word place is coming up for you as well, despite all of the virtual activity that's been going on. So the virtual texts have become so important.
And in terms of transience, one of the things that a lot of the place work assumes is that people have one place, whereas in fact, many, many people are mobile. And I could have added a whole stream to this talk if I'd had room for it, just about the mobility that we now assume. Although COVID has put a clamp on that to some extent, made us notice it more, but now we're not doing it nearly so much. And here we are, not in a room with each other.
That's right. Virtual mobility. We can be anywhere in the world virtually, but physically we have had to stay put.
Well, there's this little party game. Two people sit down at a table for lunch and each of them takes out their phone, puts it on the table. How many people are at lunch?
Good question.
It's really interesting. It changes things.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Does anyone else have questions you'd like to ask? Go ahead, Terry.
Hello, and thank you, Margaret, for an absolutely wonderful presentation. I was so intrigued with many things and taking extra notes to refer back to your PowerPoint afterwards. I do have one question that came out of one of your slides, and it was about English teachers being the frontline fighters about I'd like to think that all teachers are frontline fighters, but at the same time, I recognize that the critical capacity for students at that age might be a little bit more advanced. But I'm wondering, just with your perspective, what can we do as elementary, high school, post-secondary? Like, what can we do to be those kinds of fighters, especially when you are recognizing what's happening in Alberta?
Yeah. Well, I think to some extent, Alberta children sooner or later will see their teachers fighting about this. I mean, not all of them, obviously, but the web group against the curriculum signed up 40,000 people almost at once, and that when the first draft came out, and that is a public presence. And a way of getting forward. But I think that, I mean, I absolutely agree all teachers are in this fight, but English teachers are the ones who take a text as something to be looked at, not looked through for the content. One of the jobs of an English teacher is looking at the text. And I think finding ways of getting young children to recognize that all texts are framed and they're framed by interests. And in that sense, it was interesting to me thinking about the DVD through the 90s. The DVD opened a door to people being more aware that all media are constructed. Children are now pretty expert in the notion that, that there are bloopers So that means that this scene was made more than once and edited so that the bloopers are not there. That's a level of sophisticated information that I certainly didn't have as a child. I had no idea. Um, and so I think looking at ways that we can bring a text in as a surface to be looked at and investigated um, is something that you can do with quite young children. Um, and, you know, the picture books about the making of picture books, there's an enormous list of those now, in which somebody in the book talks about being in the book. I mean, even Elephant and Piggy do that. So we're not talking about something that is rarefied and conceptual beyond the grasp of young children. Preschoolers appreciate Elephant and Piggy, telling them, you know, I can make you turn the page. And so there's a lot of scope there for talking about the making of it. And at that point, it's a relatively straightforward step to start asking questions about who made it, why did they make it, who gets some advantage from making this, what special interests might be involved. I mean, Elephant and Piggy as special interests is a stretch, but the media, I don't know if you know Media Smarts, the media education group. They have some fairly basic stuff for quite young children about becoming more critical users of media. And it's worth looking at the kinds of things that they do. But it's all around. It used to be that people went to conferences in T-shirts that said all media are constructed. But the information for conveying that to 5-year-olds is everywhere now. So I think that's a good starting point, that this was made. Somebody made decisions about this. And what can we see about the decisions? Would you have made the same decisions? And of course, fan fiction and all those things go into the same territory, opening it up. Why did you decide that all the characters in this cartoon were going to be white? You know, how can I address that in my fan fiction? And so the raw material, it's not even raw material, it's cooked material in that sense. The material drawing attention to the cooked qualities of artistic work and informational work is all around us. So I think there's a lot of scope there. But it's, you know, it's an ongoing issue.
I like that idea of the cooked material, Margaret. I'm going to ask Rebecca. You have a question that you'd like to ask Margaret?
I do. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Shelley. Margaret, such a pleasure to spend nearly an hour listening to your ideas again. It reminds me how much I miss our conversations.
No kidding, Rebecca.
And my continued fascination with the work that you're doing. Well, one of the questions that came to mind for me is your thoughts around coding. In Ontario now, kids in elementary school are learning how to do coding, and they go to coding camps in the summer and all of this. And I was not sure how I felt about it until I saw my 2 grandsons who've learned how to code, creating their own game and developing this whole world, you know, that only they were imagining and using code. And I thought, wow, there's really something interesting here. I mean, it's still emerging and fairly new in terms of kids doing this, or at least in Ontario. And I just wondered if you have some thoughts around there, if you've come across anything about the potential of coding and how kids engage.
Not directly, Rebecca, no. In Alberta, the Minister of Education has said we're going to teach coding, but we're going to do it with pencil and paper. So it's not as if Alberta's on the front lines here. But I think you're right. It's a language. And children are sponges for learning languages. My granddaughter sent me a video of her drawing something. And the drawing was more or less what you'd expect for, well, I think she was a 7-year-old at that point. But what surprised me, and this will relate to your coding question, was her discourse. She was talking me through in a very structured and formal way. And where in the world did she learn to talk like that? She wouldn't talk like that at school, but it turns out that she had watched 12 million YouTube videos of people drawing things and talking through the drawing to instruct other people. And so she picked up that discourse and applied it quite automatically to her own little video of 2 minutes length. And I think, as with the coding, I think children will use what we give them and bring it into their own priorities. And I don't see why coding would be any different from that. And, secret languages are even better than regular languages in some ways. So there's that as well. But watch this space for how Alberta does with pencil and paper.
Well, and as you say that too, I'm just thinking about the subversiveness of teachers, hoping that that will rise as the curriculum gets more oppressive. I see that we are at noon right now. Are there any other quick questions for Margaret? And if not, then I'm going to say thank you once again, Margaret. It's been such a pleasure. Even though we can't get together in person, it's so wonderful to see you and to hear you again and to converse with you. I know that Meredith has some information about the rest of the day for those who are part of the LLRC pre-conference.